Doot, doot, doot. Hello, hello. As people join, go ahead and just go into the chat, which is at the bottom of the screen. Click on all panelists and attendees. Introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. Tell us where you're from. We're gonna just get this. We're gonna get this party started in just 1 second. We're gonna do a bunch of Q&A over the course of the next hour. So please drop any questions that you have into the little Q&A box below. We'll also be live streaming this on Facebook. It hasn't gone up yet, but when it does, oh, now it's up. We'll also be taking questions from folks on Facebook. So with that, we're gonna get this party started. Hello, everyone. My name is Ross Morales-Arquetto. I am one of the co-founders of Run for Something. And if you don't know what Run for Something is, we basically recruit and support young, diverse, progressive folks who are running for state and local office. So I'd like to welcome you to our Armchair Series. It's a weekly series where we talk to top practitioners in the electoral space to give advice on, running campaigns in a world of global pandemics, systemic racism, police violence, recessions, and global uprising. So, just like another week in 2020. I will start just by thanking some of our sponsors for this who allowed us to keep this free for everyone. So Act Blue, AFSCME, Authentic Campaigns, Fireside Campaigns, Claire and Stephen Crouppen, Onward Together, Yelp, Precision Strategies, and Planned Parenthood. Today, we have one of my favorite humans, Emmy Ruiz, who is a friend, somebody who has tons of experience in the electoral space, but also is on the board of Run for Something, just for full disclosure. So technically, Emmy is my boss. She's one of the best operatives in the party. She served as a senior advisor for Senator and hopefully future Vice President Kamala Harris's presidential campaign this cycle. In 2016, she was the Nevada State Director during the primaries and the Colorado State Director for the general election for the Clinton campaign. She worked on the Obama reelect in 2012 and is a veteran of dozens of campaigns. She's also from the state of Texas as well. So we have something in common other than our love of politics. And she's here today to talk to us about campaign management. So Emmy, to start, I just love if you could quickly, spend a few minutes introducing yourself, who you are, and why you do the work that you do.
Hi, Ross. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm so excited to be a part of this. So as Ross mentioned, my name is Emmy Ruiz. I am zooming in from Austin, Texas. I grew up in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley in this little town, La Feria, Texas. It's also really fun to look back and think about what got you into politics and also what keeps you in politics. So what really got me into politics was around 2006, 2007, was right after Hurricane Katrina. I was working at the American Red Cross, and I got to see a few things. One is how deeply fortunate I had been in my upbringing and the privileges I was benefiting from. Two, that even the largest nonprofit in the world, in the country, didn't have the resources needed to provide to communities. And I felt that was the role of government. And maybe most importantly, there was this queen, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who was running for president. And I just couldn't resist. I had admired her for so long, longer than I could even remember. And she was running for president. And so I was actually very lucky to get hired as the first field organizer for her in Nevada in 2007. And so what keeps me in politics? As everyone here knows, politics is really hard. It requires a lot from all of us, and definitely a deep commitment. But what keeps me in politics, what keeps me in organizing today is my little one, Henry. He's 2.5 years old. He was born 6 weeks early, and he spent 3 weeks in the NICU. And he has every opportunity available to him, more books than we can get through. And I believe that Henry should not be the exception. I believe he should be the rule. And so whatever every child in this nation needs, whatever they require, whatever they deserve to strive, thrive, and survive, I believe that that is on us as a government, as organizers, to do our best to give them every single opportunity available. And so that's why I hang around with people like Ross.
Well, I appreciate it. My first question to you, we're like here to talk about sort of like managing campaigns. Like, so we're just gonna like jump right in. Like, what makes like a good campaign manager, and then maybe even like what makes a bad campaign manager?
Ooh. Well, like I think what makes a good campaign manager is somebody who has a very steady and thoughtful and good strategy, right? Needed to win. Is somebody who has a very, very, very clear understanding of what they need to accomplish, of what their values are, and how to get there. So that's three things, right? So one is, what do you need to win? A good campaign manager needs to always, always, always stay very, very focused on what that is, no matter the curveball, no matter the chaos around you, no matter the global pandemic that you might be living through. You have to be very focused on what it's going to take to win. Two, how do you get there? Right? What is the path that you're going to take? How much money do you need to raise? Who are the people, who are the voters that you need to mobilize to get there in order to accomplish that goal? And third, the reason I say values, a lot of times people say to me, oh God, you're such a hippie, you're so hopeful, this and that. That is all intertwined with success, right? You can be one of the smartest people around. You can be a brilliant strategic mind. But if you treat people poorly, if you can't get along with your candidate, if you don't have a good moral compass, are people going to want to work with you? Are you going to be able to bring people together? Are you going to be able to keep people engaged as a part of your team when the going gets tough? No, right? Good managers with strong values, with a very clear sense of mission, keep people engaged, keep people inspired, and help us all, push ourselves, especially in those really difficult days, which for those of you that are in politics, you know that there are many, many, many of those days.
There are. Actually, that's like a thing. I think the last piece about values is a thing that gets like really underrated, especially for folks who are like political operatives, like looking to work for a candidate. Like, working in politics is amazing and it sucks. It's so hard, like every day. And if you don't like really believe in the person that you're working for, and understand what their values are, it's really hard to get up every single day and do the things that you have to do to win. But we're not here to hear from me, so I'm going to ask Emmy some more questions. How do you find a good manager? And I guess sort of like attached to that is like, how do you like know what the right model of like a campaign manager is like for for different types of candidates?
So, I mean, I often do this exercise with myself, with others. So it's more of, so if I'm the candidate and I'm running for office, right, a down ballot race, I do ask myself, what are the skill sets? What do I need my type of manager to entail, right? Every campaign is very different. So for example, a school board race in Austin, Texas could range anywhere from $100,000 to $1.5 million. In Los Angeles, 2 million is pretty normal for a school board race, right? So the level of experience, the level of management, the level of capacity that a campaign manager might have to provide in either of those scenarios might vary greatly, right? And so it's really important to do an assessment of what is needed, what are the skills, what are the resources that you already have and that you might be missing. And then I would also weigh them as to where do you put the greatest stock, right? So for me, when I'm hiring, I will take somebody with less experience any day of the week if they're hungry, if they have a positive attitude, if they're out there, they know they have something to prove and are going to give it their all. To me, there's a lot more value in that versus somebody who's been doing the work for 20 years who feels like they know it all, because we don't know it all. In fact, do we know anything? I don't know. So it's really important to make a list and then to go out and seek people that might fit that criteria.
Sort of like, and then sort of like in the next stage in the process, you know, like candidates, like interview campaign managers, they talk to people. A lot of times the people who are like the best, who do this at the highest level, sometimes need a little bit of convincing. So how would you like recommend that a candidate go about like having that conversation with a campaign manager and trying to convince them to come on board? Because, you know, I think we know that like the fit is really important both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I will actually rewind a little bit and talk a little bit about the interview process and what I would recommend that look like. So, for example, as a candidate, I think it's really important, again, as I mentioned, to do the list of what you need in order to succeed, right? And so there are, I think, great understandings out there of what you don't need. So, for example, I would never recommend you hire somebody from your family or your spouse, your partner in life, to manage a race, right? That is setting yourself up for some very difficult situations, right? I would try to find somebody who's going to be honest with you, no matter what the circumstance might be. But a lot of times when you're interviewing or where you're looking for somebody to fill such a critical role, it's easy to fall into the comforts, the agreements, the things that you might see in alignment. But ask yourself, what is the most important thing? And the most important thing is for you to win. And in order to do that, you really have to have a healthy combination of both. So in an interview process, I would definitely walk through some of the core competencies that you need. Have they ever managed staff before? Have they ever worked on a campaign before? You know, how familiar are they with the geography of the community, the office that you're running for? What approach would they take? What are some of the leadership skills and values that they admire, that they appreciate? And then I would say two other things. Walk through different scenarios. Ask them to walk through a scenario with you. You know, if you're not hitting your fundraising goals, what are the different steps they would take to assess the problem and address the problem, right? So it will allow you to identify, you know, how they approach a problem through critical thinking, through solution-oriented lens, and how they can think quickly on their feet. And last, it is really important to have a great relationship, and to get to know one another. And I think that this gets to the core piece of your question, Ross, is like, how do you get somebody to take that leap and to take a job where, you know, they might not see the value, they might not feel valued, they might not feel like it's that next appropriate career move for themselves, or they might have to take a pay cut, right? There are a lot of different scenarios that might keep somebody from taking a job. I think it's really important to build that personal relationship from the start. You know, what are their values? Why did they take this interview to begin with? Why would they be interested? What is their personal story? Why did they get involved in politics to begin with? And use all of that information as an asset for you to try to persuade someone. The last thing I would say here is that the roles of candidate and campaign manager, it's a real partnership, right? It's an incredible partnership where you're going to be in it together through thick and thin. And so it's important for you to also, in some ways, I believe, interview for the candidate, right? So this is the same advice I give campaign managers. Interview the candidate. Do you align on what the priorities for a candidate campaign need to look like, for the work that it's going to entail, for how to approach difficult situations? And so I would say building that relationship can go a very long way into persuading somebody to take that jump.
Yes, plus one to all of that. All right, so you interview for the job, like you get it, you're like a newly minted campaign manager for someone. What are like the first, like when you hit the ground, like what are the first few things that you do?
Ooh, find the local taco shop, number one. Number two, try to download as much information as possible from the people that have either been a part of the current campaign or have experience locally running any of those types of campaigns. So one is, for example, if your candidate has already launched, tell me everything. How much money came in? Where is this information stored? You know, where is the campaign office? Do we need a campaign office? What is our budget? How much money has been raised so far, period? What are the rules that I need to know? What are the laws? So you have one, information for this specific campaign that is specific to the candidate. Two, information that is specific to the different race. So that's more of like the color, the community, the voters. What are the political implications that you need to know? And then also, of course, is the law. So like, what are the rules you need to know? When are the reports going to be due, etc. Use that all of that information to put together a campaign plan as quickly as possible. I will tell you, a big mistake that I see a lot of campaign managers make is that they get thrown into the environment and they're like, I don't have time to create a plan. I have to staff my candidate. I have to do call time. I have to do data entry. Well, you know what? The most important thing you can do for your campaign is to put together a campaign plan that will serve as your roadmap, that will help you check in, that will help provide updates as to whether you're on track or you're making the progress that you need in order to win. And so make sure that you take that time.
Yeah, and on campaign planning, we have a question from someone asking sort of about strategic plans, but like when you're putting together a campaign plan, like what goes into it for you? Where do you start? Like how do you think about them?
Yeah, I mean, like I'll say again, it's very different for everyone. Every race is different, even if it's the same position in a different state, different county, neighboring county, even sometimes. And so keep that in mind as I answer this. To me, a good campaign plan falls under three criteria: money, message, and mobilization. You know, how much money do you need to raise? What are the limitations that you have? How much money do you think you can raise? That's very important. It's very important to be honest with yourself and with your campaign and your candidate, so that you're putting together a campaign plan based in reality. Okay. Two, what is the message that you need to articulate? A lot of times, especially on Zooms like this, we get very, the phrase is not carried away, but we dream so big about what is possible in a campaign plan. And you're like, well, I need to hire a pollster. I need an analytics firm. I need all this. Most of the races that we're talking about, you're going to have neither, right? And so you know the audience that you're trying to reach, you know the race that you're running for, their purview, and what the constituents care about. Keep it simple and keep it on track and keep it on message. Why are you running? Who are you? And why should they pick you, right? You don't have to go into nationalizing a race. You don't have to go into things that are neither here nor there. Stay focused. And that message that you decide on, you have to make sure that it is incorporated in everything that you're doing. And last but not least, the third M, which is the most important M, is mobilization. Look, you can win a race if you fall short of your fundraising goal. You can win a race if you accidentally, although I do not recommend overspending. You can win a race even if you have a very poor message. You cannot win a race if you do not mobilize more voters than your opponent. That is as simple as it gets. And so the first two, money and message, are intertwined with mobilization. Building the capacity that you need to win, identifying the voters that are with you, and turning them out to vote. For those of you that might spend some time on Twitter, although I don't recommend it, you will know that we are in the season of the polar coaster, right? Some days Democrats are really high up and others days we're not. Guess what? What I always say is, on the days where we're up, it doesn't matter, because what is the vote tally at the moment between Donald Trump and Joe Biden? It is 0-0. What matters are the votes that are cast. That's the scoreboard that we need to be focused on. And so those are the three components that I would put into a campaign plan. Recognize that it's going to look very different depending on the race. If you're running for school board, why are you running for school board? How are you going to work within the board? How are you going to support the parents, the students, the staff, right? It's very different than if you're running for Congress. You're talking about healthcare, you're talking about COVID recovery. Although right now there is an intersection of COVID and everything that we're doing. But an example that I used to give is, you're running for school board, you're running for city council, you're probably not talking about the Mueller report. And so it's very, very important that you stay very focused on what is needed.
We got a really interesting question from Nathan in the Q&A, and Nathan's asking basically about, like, how do you run a campaign when you're an introvert? I think there's been a lot of like media depictions of like the campaign manager have sort of like the brusque, grumpy dude who's like barking out orders to everyone and is like always on the phone, and especially after 2008 is on television. So like, what advice would you give to folks who for whom that like kind of stuff is more difficult?
Yeah, Nathan, I am so glad you asked this question. I think it is such an important question. Let me point out first that you don't see a lot of campaign managers that look like me, and you especially didn't see a lot of campaign managers that look like me when I started in politics 13 years ago. And so I think it is really all of our responsibilities to really redefine what leadership means, and not just in our party, but in everything that we do, whether we're talking about parental roles, whether we're talking about businesses or politics or government. And so when I talk about values too, I also want to push everyone to think about the type of leaders that they want to be. A lot of times we do think about the leaders that we emulate or the leaders that motivate us as people. And sometimes that can be very different than the leader your team needs, right? And also, we're all different people. And so my leadership style might not be yours, but if you're still, leading with purpose and impact, it's not going to matter, right? I'll give you one example of how I learned this the hard way. I was a field organizer, as I mentioned, in 2007 and 2008. And at that time, was very much the campaign manager model that Ross described, like masculine, hairy, rough, drinking a lot, kind of, just I don't even like want to think about it, right? Very tough, very like work harder, do this, do that. And one of the ways that they would motivate the field organizers at the time was to ask us, well, do you even really believe in your candidate? I mean, you only made 100 calls. Like, if you really believe that this candidate should win, you should be making 200 calls a night. And for those of us that were true believers, we would think, oh my God, I want to make 300 so that Hillary knows I really love her or whatever, right? Well, then I became a manager. And I remember my paid canvassers were late one morning. And I asked them, because that's a way that my manager had motivated me. That was a leadership model that I had seen. And I gave my best TED talk, if you will. And I said, do you all even really care about Hillary Clinton? Like, you were all late. You really need to ask yourselves. And I laid it on so thick. I didn't yell. I didn't curse or anything that was unprofessional, but I laid it on very thick. I went and dropped them off in the field, and they called me about 2 hours later and they said, Emmy, we've been really thinking about what you said. And I was like, oh, guys, don't, just let it go. It's fine. We're good. Knock those doors. Go get him, Tiger. I said, no, you're right. We don't care. We quit. They all quit. Okay. And so that was one of the many times that really taught me a valuable lesson, that it's really important to be a leader that is authentic to you and who you are. And a leader that is just as important that your team needs, right? Really identifying what is going to motivate them and what is going to give them the tools that they need to succeed. To me, those two things are more important than being an extrovert or an introvert or whatever the case might be. But it's going to just take some time, Nathan, for us to break these barriers. And I think that you should be a part of it. And you should just say, look, I'm going to be very responsive. I'm going to have a great campaign plan. I'm never going to let my team down. I'm going to work very hard. And I'm going to be very, these are the values that I care about, and focus on that versus, some people are cheerleaders, others are not, and that's okay. But I think a lot of us are participating in breaking down some of these norms. I don't know, Ross, do you have any thoughts on that?
My feeling is that where Emmy goes, I follow. I think in all seriousness that basically, like what Emmy said's right. You have to take the model that's authentic to you. And I think it's really important when you're working, when you're like you're interviewing the candidate just as much as the candidate's interviewing you when you're having those initial conversations. I think it's really important to find a candidate whose expectations of the role align with what you're able to give to that role. Because I've been in positions where I've managed campaigns where just my style didn't fit well with the candidate. They wanted someone that was going to be like more outwardly aggressive than I am by nature. They needed something a little bit different. And I think if I had had some of those conversations on the front end, it would have saved a lot of time and energy. And I think everyone probably would have ended up being happier at the end. So I think, that's why it's really important for the manager and the candidate to be like really in sync, or at the very least for each other to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of each other are. I think that, so the next question is about, different types of candidates need different types of campaign managers, and different types of campaigns need a different type of campaign manager. So, I mean, I'd love if you can just talk a little bit about the different models there are for the role of a campaign manager in a campaign, since it can look very different. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who have a preconceived notion that a campaign manager has to be a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a hard question. I mean, it really varies, again, race by race. And it goes back to really having a good understanding of what a campaign needs, and also throwing out some of these antiquated norms of what a campaign structure should look like. I think a good leader, whether it be the candidate or the campaign manager, builds a campaign team to fill gaps and to ensure that it is, like a 360 of strength, right? That they're filling the gaps that they might see, or weaknesses that they might see in themselves, so that there's strength all around. I think that there have been different models. Some congressional races tend to hire maybe a campaign manager that has a lot of finance experience, right? Because a lot of the time that congressional candidates are spending is spent on raising money. Smaller races might end up hiring somebody with more organizing experience, because they're also doing the role of a volunteer coordinator and data entry and whatnot. On presidentials, I mean, look, on this presidential primary, we saw the gamut of differences between campaign managers and different structures, with chairs, with deputies, with inside outside advisors. And so it really just differs. I think some of the principles that I would maintain, no matter the structure that you outline for yourself, is making sure that there's very clear line of responsibility, there's very clear lines of communication, that no one is taking on too much responsibility. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the mistakes that we make as leaders is that even if well-intended, right, we want to own a bigger piece of the pie, but it really increases, I think, the chance of failure, because you don't have the capacity to manage 10 different people yourself. They're doing 10 different things. And so thinking through from a point of capacity, a point of communication, a point of clarity and responsibilities, with that in mind, what is the structure that needs to take place?
Yeah, and I think building on that, what are some of the pitfalls that you see, especially for folks who are doing who are managing campaigns for the first time? How do you avoid them as a manager? And honestly, for a lot of our folks as candidates, how do you put your manager in a place where they don't fall into some of them?
Set them up for success. I think some of the big challenges that I see in first-time managers is, I think it can be phrased one of two ways: an abundance or a complete lack of vulnerability. Of just being honest about what you do know or don't know, of what you can do or can't do. what is in your wheelhouse and should be in your wheelhouse versus what should not. And that, in my opinion, vulnerability is a very close cousin of communication and being able to say what you can own or not own. The challenges I see in first-time campaign managers is they feel it's well-intentioned, right? A tremendous amount of responsibility and a tremendous amount of weight to do a job well, to fill a commitment, to deliver on their promise. But there's a lot of value in being able to say that you don't know how or you can't do something. And so there's that. And then, the third piece between vulnerability, communication is the ability to ask for help from peers, from kitchen cabinets, from candidates, from even frenemies and foes, right? Of how to get something across the finish line. That's really important in knowing when to ask for help. So, I think the biggest challenges that I've seen in first-time campaign managers is that they take on too much without the ability to self-manage.
And on the other side of that, what are some of the challenges that you see sometimes with first-time candidates, like as they're going out there, and like the challenge that like as a campaign manager might have and so managing some of those things? I think it's important and the reason I'm asking is I think it's important for both sort of like groups of folks to understand what the other is going through, because I think often like when we end up in bad situations with candidates and managers is often because there just hasn't been enough communication, and there's not a full understanding between like both groups of people for what the other is going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think there are a lot of similarities between the two. I would say three things when it comes to candidates. One, the challenges that I have seen, okay? This doesn't have to be the case for everyone, is sometimes I feel like candidates don't always have the strongest understanding of why they're running or why they wanted to run, right? And the reason that that's important, in my opinion, it comes back to values. It comes back to all this hippy-dippy stuff. It's going to be really hard, right? That ties into my second piece. They didn't have a clear understanding of how hard it was going to be. Like, people like me came into town and were like, you should run. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be so great. You're going to get this endorsement. We're going to help you raise money. And people have not really walked through how difficult it's going to be to not just run for office, to be a mom, to pay your bills, to do your job, to be a wife, to be a daughter, to get roasted on the internet. Like all of these different things people have not walked through, or they have not believed it, how hard it was going to be. And three, a willingness to do the hard work and to fail, right? And you need to have a real clear understanding of the first two. One, how hard it's going to be. Well, really, one is why you're running, tied into how hard it's going to be, because if you really know why you're running, when it's super hard, it's going to be okay. You can like stay focused on your North Star. And three, a commitment to doing the work, because like it's going to be really hard to raise money. Even people who have a tremendous amount of success have to really go through a slog of perfecting their pitch, people that they love and respect and admire supporting maybe their opponent, or not being able to, or wanting to contribute, or contributing less than they could have imagined. And so there are similarities, I think, amongst the two, of really knowing why you're in something, how hard it's going to be, and then a real commitment to doing the work.
Yeah, and actually, just to build on that for 1 second, one of the things that I tell a candidate every time like I start working with them is like, take a look at the people in your life and the ones that you love and your close friends, your family. Some of those people are absolutely going to disappoint you, like along the way, like for whatever reason. And people always have reasons, and oftentimes they're good reasons.
Yeah.
Family members often feel uncomfortable about the campaign, especially for, like as we as we work to make our democracy like a more like reflective like of like our communities, you know, we're having folks run who have stories of trauma and they're telling their story every day. Oftentimes their family doesn't want to be a part of that. They support it, they're happy that they're running, they want them to run, but they don't want to be in the room. They don't, you know, they don't want to be around the campaign all that much because it brings up memories. So I think it's important, especially if you're thinking about running, and it's important if you're a manager to know and understand those things. And that actually gets into another question that I'm gonna ask, and then I'll get to a couple of audience ones, which is like, as a manager, especially for folks who like don't look like, you know, like like the candidates that like, you know, like old white dudes, lawyers, you know, like rich business owners. How do you work with a candidate who like might be telling their story every day that like might have some trauma associated with it? Like, what is your responsibility as a manager, like as you like work with a candidate who might be like having to go out there and making themselves vulnerable like that?
You know, you just keep the hard balls coming, don't you, Ross? I think it's really hard because, again, this is my experience with working with people and women of color, is that even when you are a person of color, it's really hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But I think it's really important that the manager tries, right? And, you know, one of the things that it's really important for a manager and a candidate to do right off the bat is to spend some real time getting to know one another. And I don't mean just the policies and the best times to, you know, receive a briefing or call time or their, you know, kids' names or whatever. But I think it's also learning their strengths, their tension points, their vulnerabilities, their triggers, the things that they want to avoid, the things that they don't, how they want to view themselves throughout a campaign. And then on the flip, look, there are a lot of things that are really difficult about campaigning, whether you're a candidate or a team member or a campaign manager. And there are a lot of things that surface, right? And so it is really important, I think, as a leader, to really ask yourself, how do you set conditions? How do you create spaces to help your team members survive and thrive a specific scenario? That might be in a debate where they might have to share a very personal story or a commercial, or, you know, sometimes we're embarrassed. Sometimes we have embarrassing things happen in campaigns. And so to really try to create as much of a safe space for them, even in difficult moments of like, how can you lessen the load? How can you lessen the pain? And one thing that I often say in campaigns is, you know, for those of you that have been organizers maybe for a while, you hear a bunch of us hacks say like, oh, I'm doing this because I want to make sure people are heard or people have a voice or whatever. And we live out our values oftentimes for voters, or try to, right? But we don't do it for one another in teams or our candidates. So the same grace that you might give a voter, it's really important for you to create that space and that grace for your candidate. And to check in and ask sometimes, you know, I know this is really difficult, but is there anything I can do to make this a more comfortable experience? And sometimes that alone, asking that, helps people just really, you know, sit up a little straighter, and get it done. No, but no, every person is different, right? In the same way that Nathan said he's an introvert, some candidates are introverted. And so it might be difficult for them to speak and cheer up a crowd, or the vice versa, right? Somebody just wants to scream all day long and you're like, no, this is like an intimate sit down or an endorsement meeting or whatever the case might be. So tailor it to the individual.
We have a couple of questions from folks that are watching. You know, one of them is like actually like a really sort of like in the weeds, nitty gritty, like how much should you expect to like need to pay a campaign manager? You know, it's different at every level, but if you can just like talk about how to think through that, and maybe even like a little bit on the budgeting side.
Yeah. Ross took my talking point that it's different for every campaign. Well, you know what? In terms of campaigns, I think this is also something that's changing. That a lot of times, campaign staff were paid very, very little because of the experience. You know, people thought, well, they're getting a lot of experience. I think it's really important to pay people living wage, to provide benefits. Believe it or not, that is also something that sometimes is not covered for campaign managers or campaign staff. And to really put together a budget that is reflective of your values in that sense, but also that is reflective of the commitments that you are able to make. It doesn't do anybody any favors for you to put together a really great salary if you have not raised even an ounce or a month's worth of that salary. And so I think you should make a commitment that is reasonable, that is attainable, and that, again, provides a living wage and is appropriate to the role, the amount of staff, the amount of budget that they're going to be managing. And I think if you have to, you can negotiate with campaign manager to say, this is where we're starting, but this is not where we're ending. And as we raise more money, we can have a conversation about increasing the amount, about making any adjustments, or maybe I can help you find housing or whatever the case might be to offset if you're not able to meet them where they need to be.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I've been on a number of I've managed a handful of campaigns where I've had to cut my own salary based on how fundraising was going. So it's really tough. I did, you do that so you don't have to lay off your other staff members, but it's always a difficult decision. We have another question from the audience here that's about policy. So how do you work with the candidate, and how would you work with a candidate to think about coming up with policy and other types of messaging as you're going through the campaign?
Yeah, to me, this falls under the second M, money, message, mobilization. And so thinking through what are the voters, again, why is a candidate running? Sometimes that's tied to a policy or a platform. The voters that you're seeking to reach, what are the things that they care about? What are the things that they're living through, that they're experiencing, and that will get them to support you or help persuade them to maybe support you, right? Peel them off. And I would look at that with that scope in particular. I always recommend for down ballot races to not get in the weeds, to think through from a macro perspective, what is possible, what is easy to articulate, what is easy for a voter to understand, and to pick up, whether it be through a mail piece, a digital ad, a phone conversation, or a door knock, if we ever get back to that. So yeah, I would look at personal story, your voters, and the office that you're running for, and keep it big picture and macro. A good way also to think through some of your different policy positions is if you're running for down ballot races, well, really any race, there's usually a lot of endorsement questionnaires that will walk through the issues that tend to fall under a specific bucket or specific position, that will challenge your candidate as to where do they stand on something. And I think you can take bits and pieces from that.
We have a question here about sort of keeping the faith in the power of campaigns to push forward, and break barriers, and you have a good team, but you come up short. How do you think about that? How do you think about it from a campaign management perspective, but also just from the perspective of, knowing that we're not going to win every fight?
Well, we're living through the living embodiment of we're not going to win every fight. Okay, people, here's where I would want everyone to ground themselves in. People do not get involved in politics. People do not set out to change the world. People do not set out to serve others because it is easy. Okay, if it were easy, everyone would do it. And part of why I love organizers so much and campaigners so much is because we have this crazy ambition to serve others or to achieve really big, difficult things, right? And so remember that your ambition serves others. Number one. Number two, it's very hard. It's very difficult. And three, it is normal for it to take multiple tries as long as we are learning from it and we are making progress. I always take a lot of comfort in the races or the efforts that I'm a part of, in the accomplishments and the milestones along the way. Those things, there is nothing that somebody can take away from you, right? The number of new people that got involved in a campaign, the number of voters that may be registered for the first time, the number of first-time donors that now will become regular contributors to democracy. Those are things that cannot be undone. And I think it's really helpful if, as a leader or as a campaign team member, you are celebrating those things as you go. I'll never forget on the Kamala Harris campaign, as things were getting very difficult and we were winding down. I mean, we knew it was winding down. One of the things that Kamala Harris said, those fundraising records as a Black woman running for president, whether or not she stayed in the race, that was not something that anyone could ever take away from her or our campaign, right? And so finding those moments that you can really ground yourself in. And the last thing I would say about that is that as a leader, that's something that you should really take responsibility for, is making sure that people are staying involved, they're staying active, they're staying inspired and motivated. And that comes down to also changing the model of leadership and how we're running things that will keep people wanting to stay involved no matter how hard it is.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that we've seen from this election cycle is that things can change really quickly. A lot of folks went from having campaign plans that had them knocking on a lot of doors, then COVID hit, and then that was off the table. How do you manage, and this happens a little bit in every race, so like you've written your plan, you're executing your plan, something major happens, and then you might have to change course. How do you think about that? How do you sit down with your candidate and start to have those conversations? If you need to change your campaign plan or a significant part of your strategy.
Look, I think more times than not, what changes is the tactics. Rarely, but not never, the strategy, right? And so it's important to differentiate between the two and between what is actually impacted by a scenario. But this is another reason why a campaign plan is really important, and also setting up systems and structures for yourself as a campaign manager, because sometimes it is a global pandemic or a hurricane or international foreign interference, right? Sometimes it's those really big, I don't even think we can say half of them are acts of God, but that's what we would refer to as, miscellaneous curveballs. But then there are also times where your assumptions are not panning out. People are not answering the phones, or people are not opening their doors, or, and some of those things happen even when there's not a global pandemic. It could be that you're not hitting your fundraising goal or not. So one, it's important to have systems in place where you're continuously checking in on progress to goal. Are your assumptions working? Does it all seem on par with what you thought it would look like? For when these really big curveballs hit, land, I don't know what the right phrase is, it's important to think about, again, as I mentioned, is it shifting your strategy or is it shifting your tactics? Let's talk about door knocks, right? To me, that is shifting. Well, this pandemic, I think, shifts two things, right? It has shifted strategy in that we have this economic collapse and people are suffering in a way that maybe a lot of us could not have imagined a year ago, right? And that is a lot of different communities of color. That is people in battleground states or elsewhere that have completely lost their jobs, the way people are voting, right? It's just completely shifted a lot of that. Now, let's talk about tactics. Well, you still need those votes. So if they can't go vote in person, what happens? A lot of the strategy has shifted to getting people to apply or sign up for vote by mail or absentee voting, however you phrase it. Two, you're not knocking on doors, or at least most Democratic campaigns and organizations are not knocking on doors. Knocking on doors is commonly known as the most impactful tactic for reaching people. and connecting one-on-one, but that's because you're having meaningful conversations, right? And so how do you remove the meaningful conversation from the door knock into another tactic? But it doesn't change the fact that you need X amount of voters, right? It hasn't changed the battlegrounds. It hasn't changed that you need to raise money. It hasn't changed that you need a contrast and that you need to offer a vision for the future. And so differentiate. So 1, your plan. 2, your check-ins. 3, differentiate between strategy and tactics. 4, reimagine what is possible, right? Operate from the perspective of an exec coach of mine said one time, like being on a campaign and being a leader on a campaign is like being in a video game where, you know, they're constantly sending you like fire pellets your way and you're just trying to dodge them one by one and get to the next stage. And so really try to take that can-do, solution-oriented approach, because even if you're not dealing with these big catastrophic events, your team members are encountering challenges day in and day out. I mean, how many of us have been on a campaign where somebody got bit by a dog? Well, guess what? We still got to knock on doors, guys. So how are we going to work around this and make sure that people feel comfortable with it?
I love that. And I have worked on many campaigns where people have been bit by dogs. I have not had the pleasure of being bit by a dog.
Guys.
You know, we're running down towards the end of this. So I've got 2 more questions. The first is, what is the dumbest advice you've ever heard given to a candidate from a campaign manager? And I'll start there. Or you can say the best advice, but people always like the shady part. This wasn't on the list of questions I gave you, sorry.
I don't know. I can't think. I mean, I don't know.
What's the worst commonly held advice that like you see candidates get?
The best advice: be yourself. Share why you are running and why you. The worst advice, God. I'm sure. I mean, I don't know. Tell me what's the worst advice you've heard?
I once saw like a state leg candidate that this isn't maybe the worst, but it's very bad. That was like told, and it was like in not a very large state, that was told that they needed to send like 50 pieces of direct mail like to their voters. And like that was like the strategy that was gonna like bring them to across the finish line. It was gonna cost like over $100,000, and like there was no way that candidate was gonna raise $100,000.
Where I hear the crazy stuff is rarely from the campaign manager, more from like the kitchen cabinet.
Do it.
Right. So, God, I feel like I'm gonna out myself. I can't. But like, you know what, I'll say like when people try to nationalize local races, right? When they're like, oh, you need a focus group. And you're like, no, the focus group is people want to send their kids back to school. There's your focus group, right? Like people want safe classrooms and their teachers to be paid well. That's your, I think it's more of things like that where people try to nationalize things. Wow, now I'm really thinking, but I was thinking more on the personal end when you asked me that question of like basically really dumb things that people have said to women candidates that they should be doing.
Well, let's go to my last question, which is, what's making you hopeful right now?
You run for something.
What else is making you hopeful?
Organizers. We have really great people out there doing so much good work, so many volunteers that are really in this fight, no matter what curveball has been thrown at them in this pandemic, for their families, their jobs, that are just so committed to fighting for all of our families, to fighting for our country, for fighting that no matter how hard it's going to be in November, they're still going to stay committed. So they really inspire me. They make me hopeful. They're relentless. They don't give up, these organizers. And so, yeah. What about you? What gives you hope?
Oh, this isn't about me.
Okay, everyone in the chat, what gives you hope?
What question should I have asked you that I didn't? Like, what's a thing that you were hoping I'd ask, or that like somebody should have asked that we didn't ask you?
Am I married? I'm kidding. I'm out of control. What should you have asked me? I don't know, maybe how to make a decision about running for office, or how to like set a path to become a campaign manager.
Answer one of them. Which one?
Well, run for something. Just do it. Jump in.
And how do you set yourself on a path to becoming a campaign manager?
Number one, just start volunteering. Immediately get involved in a campaign or in your local party. Two, don't overthink it. I also see a lot of people who are like becoming field organizers who are like, I'm here to be a campaign manager. I want to work in policy. I want to do this. The best thing you can do to set yourself up to be a campaign manager is to do your current role very, very good. And to use it as an opportunity to learn about the different functions. But if you're a good manager as a regional, if you're a good manager as a press secretary, if you're a good manager as an operations manager, you can be a great campaign manager, right? These skills are transferable. And so dive in, always say yes to helping your team members, to helping your candidate. That's really how you're going to pick up a lot of that great experience. Volunteer, get involved with Run for Something candidates, go to the Arena Toolbox, learn as much as you can. Where else, Ross? There's a lot of great places where you can learn how to be a great campaign manager, but nothing is going to take the place of diving in and learning how to do it yourself. And that is starting as a volunteer or field organizer on a campaign, in my opinion.
How do you recommend that folks do that now in a world where like we're in COVID, so like you can volunteer, but it's harder, you know, you can't like go into a field office the way that you might have been able to before?
Like, it is hard because usually how you meet people is through like networking or to being in the same room. But I actually think now is the perfect time to get involved because we have very, very big problems to solve. And we need fresh ideas. We need people who have fresh eyes, who are not wearing like the mainstream goggles that I have on and that other of us have on. And so jump in, get involved, volunteer, and also participate in a lot of these Zooms, network, join some of these Slack, some of these virtual offices through Mobilize, and start putting in the work.
That is, I think, yeah, I think that's like a great thing, a great part to end on is just do the work. It's not easy. Thank you, Emmy. It is worth it. As two people who've been doing this for a while, it's totally worth it. Emmy, thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone who's on the line, who's watching on Facebook, who asked questions. You know, as we close out, I just also want to like do a little plug. We're still doing these every week. We have at least 2 more weeks of it. Next Wednesday at the same time, we're going to be talking to State Senator Nikema Williams, who is a Georgia State Senator, the chair of the Georgia Democratic Party, and is the presumptive, I believe, nominee to be John Lewis's replacement in Congress. So we will never replace John Lewis, but she will ably fill in his shoes. So get excited for that. Very excited. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being on. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks.